Omegatau, Science and Engineering in your headphones.
Hello, welcome to a new episode of Omegatau. This one is about aviation again, before we continue with more physics and a little bit more healthcare. I am talking with Tucker Hamilton, call sign Cinco. He was F-35 test pilot, and we are going to talk about flying the F-35 and testing it in particular. I became aware of Cinco because of his appearance on the Fighter Pilot podcast. I assume that many of you who are interested in this topic listen to the Fighter Pilot podcast anyway, but if you don't, then you really should listen to, in particular, this episode about the F-35 over there, because I tried to avoid duplication as much as possible. Of course, there is some overlap in the introduction, right? But fundamentally, I tried to make it a different episode. And so if you want to learn more about the F-35 in general, about its mission, about its role, not so much about testing, we cover that more here, but the more general stuff about the airplane is really nicely covered by Vincent over there on the Fighter Pilot podcast. So check it out, definitely. Apart from that, there's nothing else to say, and we'll start with Cinco's introduction.
Well, good afternoon. This is Tucker Hamilton. I am a F-35 test pilot, and I've had an opportunity in my Air Force career to do a number of flying assignments, testing F-15Cs, F-15Es, F-16s, working programmatically on the F-35 acquisition process as I worked at the Joint Program Office in D.C. And most recently, I was able to command the F-35 Development Test Squadron out at Edwards Air Force Base in California, leading an amazing team of about 1,000 people as we developed and then tested capability on all three variants of the F-35. So I have a unique perspective because I had all three variants in under my purview, and I got to fly all three of them.
Right. Now, I got to, well, I don't know you personally, but I got aware of you through the Fighter Pilot podcast. And so I recommend my listeners check out the Fighter Pilot podcast interview with you about the F-35 in general. And we will focus on some of the flying aspects, but mostly on the testing in this episode. So there will be as little as possible duplication, because I don't like that if we duplicate stuff. Yeah. So a very brief introduction. Is it fair to say that the F-35 is more or less the successor to the F-16 in terms of its role and also its potentially widespread use among the U.S. Air Force and in this case also Navy plus its partners?
I do think that's fair. It really replaces a number of mission sets that were accomplished by different platforms. So it can do close air support like the A-10, though it can't do it as well. It can do SEAD like the F-16 units that do suppression of enemy air defenses. And it can do air-to-air combat as well, but it's not as good as a Raptor or an F-15C necessarily. So it is a pretty good successor to the F-16.
Mm-hmm. All right. And its current status is basically being introduced into various air forces, but also still kind of in a process of, procedures and operations being developed. So it's kind of in very early stages of kind of operational use.
Yeah, it is. It's considered fully operationally capable, which means that when the militaries of all the partner nations in America came together, said they had a requirement and the F-35 needed to be this, that, and the other contractually, it has met all those contractual requirements and is considered fully operationally capable. But they are really still developing some ways to best use the system, though it has been used successfully in combat by the Air Force and the Marines.
Where? Just curious.
They deployed them in the Middle East.
Okay.
So they have used both the F-35B off of a LHD carrier for the Marines, and the Air Force has also used the F-35A in combat.
So you just mentioned the versions A and B. There is also a C version. Can you talk a bit about the differences?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, for sure. The A variant is what we call a CTOL variant, conventional takeoff and landing variant. And that is what you think of all aircraft. They take off and land on a runway that is not on the water. And then you have the F-35B, and that primarily replaces the Harrier aircraft. So it hovers, and it is what we call a STOVL, short takeoff, vertical landing. So it can vertically take off, but it needs to be super low on gas. So you never do that.
Yeah.
So it's short takeoff, and then it can vertically land. And then the F-35C is what we call the CV variant, which is carrier variant. And that does catapults and traps off aircraft carrier, big deck aircraft carriers.
Yeah, like real aircraft carriers, as the Navy would say. What is the difference in terms of the aircraft, let's say, features or design characteristics?
Well, the aircraft actually don't have too much in common internally. It's like 30% or something low because of all the different mechanics that are inside. But the outside looks very similar. The F-35A is about the same size as the F-35B. The F-35C has 8-foot longer wingspan. So it has bigger wings that fold up so they can neatly fit on an aircraft carrier.
And supposedly has a lower approach speed for the carrier. That's where the big wings
That's
come
exactly.
in.
Yeah, that's why the F-35C has the larger wings. And with those larger wings, the F-35C has larger tails. And it has a little bit different landing, actually completely different landing gear because of the impact of having to land on an aircraft carrier. Yeah, the F-35B has a lift fan to allow it to hover. The back engine completely swings down, which is really awesome, really amazing engineering. And it's hard to tell sometimes the difference between the A and the B, but the B has little like what you call little ears or eyebrows that are that stick up a little bit, that are little humps behind the cockpit. Yeah, and the F-35A also has a gun on the left-hand side that you can kind of see, even though it's all stealthy. So there's a door that opens and there's a gun, and it's the only one that has an internal gun. The others have external guns.
I met the Rolls-Royce engine guys in Farnborough in 2016, I think, and they had a exhibit about the F-35 propulsion system. It was developed jointly with Rolls-Royce. And so there's this, I mean, people, if you've never seen it, there's this huge vertically blasting fan basically behind the cockpit to do the vertical stuff. And there is, if I understand correctly, a mechanical clutch that connects the engine's forward drive shaft through some gearbox to this fan.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's remarkable. And not only that, it's very good. Like, it's reliable and it works kind of seamlessly for the pilot. They did a very good job with the design, a number of things, but definitely with the design of that engine. It's a marvel. It's an engineering marvel, the way they put it together. And if you've ever seen, you should go look on videos. I even have videos online if your listeners want to check me out on Instagram at Cinco Hamilton, or even TikTok at Cinco Hamilton.
We will link to it.
Okay, yeah, and there's some videos of F-35's Bs hovering, but when you see this aircraft hovering, it is very eerie, because when you watch a Harrier hover, it's kind of dancing around a little bit and it looks unstable. When you see this aircraft hover, it is solid like a rock. It is really, really well done and really cool to watch. And also on top of that, super intuitive to fly, where it's not that complicated. A pilot really could, after a few hours, learn how to hover safely and land that aircraft safely because of all the autonomy that goes into it.
I'll get back to that in 2 minutes, but one thing we should probably mention, you kind of mentioned in passing that they all have the same outer shape, which is of course really crucial because that shape is a major ingredient in one of its major features, being stealth, right?
Yeah, so the F-35 is the first ever dual role stealth fighter. So it does air-to-air and air-to-ground. Those are the two roles. And the stealth is a generational leap in capability from even the F-22. And the way that you get stealth is the material you use, the angles that you cut, the way the air flows around the wings and into the engine, You have the way the radar is, like all these different things allow it to be stealthy. And another thing is embedded sensors allow it to be stealthy. So if you have a regular aircraft, you're going to have antennas on that aircraft. And those antennas are actually really loud to someone searching for you in the radar spectrum. So if you can get rid of all those antennas, it's stealthier. And that's what you have with the F-35. If you look at it, you don't see any antennas around the aircraft. It's smooth because that increases stealth capability.
Yeah. Yeah, I saw a diagram somewhere that basically suggested that I would say, a well-maintained F-35 with everything, nicely ram painted and stuff, has the radar cross-section basically of a more or less comparable to a bird, like a larger bird, something like that. And that was impressive.
Yeah, I can't speak to any of that, but it is very good.
Yeah, right. Okay, of course, it's secret. All right, let's talk about flying this thing. I think it's not even really worth mentioning that it obviously has a fully computerized digital flight control system, which gives it this artificial stability that you mentioned when hovering.
Yeah.
Talk a bit about the cockpit in terms of controls and also a bit about avionics.
Sure. If you look at any cockpit, minus the F-22. The F-22 is pretty sleek inside. You're going to see buttons all over. You're going to see multiple different screens. The pilot is very busy interacting with the mechanical switches. The F-35 is not like that at all. There are, I think, 14 or so switches or buttons that a pilot could possibly mess with. There's not really any that we use in flight at all, except for the gear handle. So everything else is a switch on the throttle or stick. So HOTAS, we call it, hands-on throttle and stick, or the touch screen that's in front of us. And it's a 8 by 20 inch touch screen that's broken up into 4 portals. Those 4 portals, the 2 on the left can be combined into 1, and the 2 on the right can be combined into 1, which means you can basically take video and really expand it onto 2 portals, and you're looking at a very nice, reliable screen in front of you. A lot of submenus. So as a pilot, you really need to understand what you're looking at and where you want to put it, because it's all selectable. Every pilot flies differently, though we do have standards of what is, teaching young people how to fly.
Training,
And each of these menus have submenus and a lot of different selections that you can have. You can do almost all of that with your hands off the screen. And you can do a number of those things with your voice, which we don't actually use too much. We primarily use voice control for radio changes.
Siri, lower the gear.
Yeah, exactly. We don't eject. Wait, no, I didn't mean it. Ah! Yeah, nothing like that. So we interface with the panels primarily through our hands-on throttle and stick, but it's really also very easy to just take your hands off the throttle and stick and have auto throttle and autopilot engaged, and then just do a lot of your work up on the screens. It's a very good touchscreen system. It's also very reliable. I feel like I'm selling the F-35 at times because I speak so highly of it, but it legitimately is a very good aircraft.
The touch screen stuff basically is only really useful in kind of straight and level, because if you have G's and turbulence, then it's probably a bit annoying.
It is. So basically, if you're under 2 G's, if you're under 2 G's, you can still use it, though your hands are probably not on the screen because you're turning. Though the autopilot can turn you in certain patterns if you set it that way. But you're totally right. You want to be kind of straight and level or in an easy turn to be able to use the touchscreen.
Yeah. Okay.
But that's where the HOTAS comes in. Because the HOTAS is also very effective.
Yeah.
And can do everything you need it to.
I mean, the same statement is true for mechanical switches. You don't want to operate them under 5 Gs, but at least you have some tactile way of keeping your hand oriented, which you don't have at all with the touchscreen. So, but I mean, as you say, in high dynamic moments, you would use HOTAS stuff anyway.
Yeah.
I heard about Actually, one of my listeners mentioned that there's a transparent cockpit.
Yeah, it's really neat. So I can get into some more of the avionics, and
Yeah.
I'll start with that. It's called the Distributed Aperture System, or DAS for short, DAS. The DAS system is a combination of 6 cameras that are on the skin of the aircraft. So they're outside the aircraft. And they're continually recording the world around them in IR. And they're weaving together that video so that the pilot can select it and pull it up in their helmet. And the video they're looking at then is video of outside the aircraft, which means if you look down, you don't see your feet, you see the ground beneath you. So it allows you to look through the aircraft. Now, it was developed for missile defense. So a missile's inbound, you look through the cockpit off your nose, hypothetically, and you see the missile inbound. So now you can react to that missile. We primarily, though, use it for just night navigation because it turns the night into day. It does get a little challenging. If you get in close to other aircraft, there's a little parallax, is what we call it. Because the cameras are not where your eyes are as a pilot, there's always an offset. So, like, for instance, on an air refueling tanker, it can be disorienting. So we don't use it up close to tanker aircraft. But it's very good capability that allows a pilot to kind of see the world around them, primarily at night, and it gives them that capability.
Cool. And it doesn't have a head-up display, right? Because everything is in the helmet.
Right. It's what we call a virtual heads-up display.
Sure. Yeah.
So we have the HMD, and in the HMD, which once again, this helmet, I mean, they're very expensive, but they're very good and very reliable.
Yeah.
And Rockwell Collins did an amazing job with that. This helmet, when you look out front of the helmet where your heads-up display usually is, there is what looks like a heads-up display. It has all that information. And even if you turn your head fast, that HUD is always oriented right out front of the cockpit. So if you look to the side, the HUD slowly disappears as you turn your head. And then you see other augmented reality. And then as you turn back in, it looks like it never had moved. Like it's always there in front of you. In front, like literally not where you're looking in front of you, like in the front of the aircraft. It always looks like it's right there.
It is where a HUD would be.
Exactly. Right. And it doesn't move. It's solid.
Yeah. Is that a bug or a feature? Because you could say, why not move along with your turning head?
It'd be totally disorienting. Yeah, maybe, there's too much information in the HUD.
Yeah.
So you get key pieces of that heads-up display, virtual heads-up display. As you turn left or right or around, you still get information like, hey, how fast am I going? What's my heading? You do get that still, but they take away a lot of that other information and augment other things that you'd be interested in.
In terms of navigation, it's probably mostly based on GPS, right? I mean, I'm not talking about sensors and radars and stuff, but actual like long-range style navigation, that would be mostly GPS.
Yeah, I mean, yes, you have GPS, and then you have the typical navigational tools that aircraft have. So, you'll have the ILS landing system and TACAN.
Does it have civilian ILS?
Yeah, cool. Totally.
Oh, okay.
The funny thing is, and your listeners will probably appreciate this, it doesn't have radios the way that people think of radios. They're able to basically emulate radio frequencies, but they don't have what you think of as like a regular receiver and amplifier transponder. Like it's the aircraft emulating all of the frequencies needed in order to navigate without necessarily having all the same equipment that traditional aircraft have had.
SDR, software defined radio, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So let's talk a bit about flying this thing. First of all, there is no two-seater, right? So
right. All single seat.
Yes. Your first flight is in a single seater then. Obviously, there is a simulator in which you train. So I imagine in an aircraft like the F-35, which has a completely synthetic feel anyway, because it's synthetically provided by the flight control system, you would expect that the simulator is very similar because it can basically use the same software.
Mm-hmm. It is. Yeah, the simulator is very good. And I think the F-35 changes what it means to be a fighter pilot a little bit, because of the capability of the systems in it. And that's one of them. The way to train pilots in the past was fly them. I could do some things in a simulator. For instance, when I was flying my F-15C, I could go in and practice a lot of air-to-air engagement stuff. But there was nothing like getting in the air, because when you're flying in the air, you're dealing with all the dynamics and you're looking outside a whole lot to make sure that you're keeping awareness of any friends or enemies that are flying near you. And we call that, within visual range maneuvering. And our formations were within visual range of each other. Well, the F-35, you don't really do that as much because there's so much awareness that the pilot has in the F-35. They no longer are looking outside as much because the information is in front of them on their touchscreen. And that allows them to go into a simulator and really practice more like they're actually going to fly, as well as the simulators have gotten better. The visuals in a simulator have gotten better. And so you can really do a lot of training effectively in a simulator like no platform before.
Yeah. Do you know DCS, the Digital Combat Simulator PC game thing?
I have heard of it.
Because I was wondering if the professional sims you guys use, I mean, obviously they are potentially more realistic and have the motion system, but in terms of the visuals, these games these days, they are so good. And when I was in a commercial simulator for an A380 not too long ago, the visuals sucked in comparison. So I was wondering how yours were.
They're pretty good visuals. I don't know compared to that game. I've done some pretty high-end sim work with other aircraft. I got certified in a King Air 350. And so we went down to flight safety in Atlanta, Georgia, and did those simulators that actually like legitimately count as flying hours because they're so good. And I think our visuals are just as good as that.
Okay. Yeah. So if I remember correctly, the C version has some kind of automatic carrier landing system. And I think I also remember that you didn't land on a carrier, correct?
Yeah, so the Air Force pilots, a few of us that they allowed to fly the F-35B and F-35C, we don't do any boat work at all. We're not qualified at all to do that. They leave that to the professionals. And our Navy and Marine test pilots were the ones that did all that work. And mind you, we flew all three variants at Edwards and did mission systems testing with all three variants. So mission systems is us being able to use the platform on the battlefield. But the flight science testing for the F-35B and F-35C were done at Patuxent River. And that's where they did all the carrier landing certification stuff. But they do have, and I'm very well aware because I flew the F-35C and I've done approaches with the F-35C on runways and trying to land on the zones that they would use on a carrier. But they have something called the ICLS. So that's Instrumented Carrier Landing System. And it's not fully autonomous, though the capability is easily there. The F-35C is very easy to land on an aircraft carrier because of its control authority that it has, its intuitiveness. It's just very intuitive for the pilot to control. And these systems that really make it just easier for the pilot. I will say the Super Hornet, and I think the Hornet as well now, they have something called Magic Carpet.
Yeah, I was going to mention that.
Yeah, it's very, very, very similar. So Magic Carpet has transformed the ease of getting on the aircraft carrier for the F-18, just like ICLS and the F-35C is allowed for. We call it Delta Flight Path in the F-35C, how that's allowed us to get on the aircraft carrier.
And Magic Carpet is, of course, some kind of abbreviation and, of course, gets the best abbreviation award. I don't know what it means, but getting to an abbreviation that abbreviates to Magic Carpet in this context is just great.
Yeah.
So you said that the F-35 flies very intuitively. Can you explain this a little bit, maybe in comparison to the F-15 and the F-16? Because the F-16, as far as I understand, the F-15 is basically, I mean, it does have some electronic support. Basically, when you pull the stick, you have to know how hard you can pull to not over-G the airplane. In the F-16, you just pull and it gets you whatever G's it can. So how how would you compare the F-35 to both of those? How is it even more intuitive than the 16?
Well, the F-15 is hydromechanical.
Yeah.
So you pull the stick back and there's hydraulic lines that go tell the surfaces to move. And when you're flying the F-15, it is, for me, it's a little more responsive. It feels traditionally like what you think about, where you feel the aircraft kind of moving through the air. You get some response from the stick, but it's actually kind of simulated response from the stick in the sense that there's some stick shakers and things that help you know where you're getting to certain regimes. And that's very different than the F-16, which is now digital flight controls. Well, they also had analog flight controls. Some of those earlier blocks still are flown have analog flight controls. But regardless, a computer is basically in charge of keeping the aircraft, the F-16, stable. And as a pilot, you're just bringing inputs in. The difference, though, is in how that system interfaces with the pilot. Because, for instance, when they started the F-16 initially, the stick didn't move at all. Like it was just a rock and solid. It didn't have any kind of flex. So you could be pulling back and be putting 5 pounds on it or 50 pounds on it, and you didn't really have a good feel for how much you should be putting on it to get a response that you wanted. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's just all, based on pressure. The F-35 and the Raptor, really, the F-16 started, the Raptor is the next step where you get some pretty good feel in the stick. So now they're emulating what it would feel like if you had that kind of control. And the F-22 did very well, and the F-35 is like that next generational step where it feels like you're flying an older traditional flight control system when you are not. You are really just voting. And when you pull back, you don't know what is actually helping you climb. If I'm straight and level and I pull back on the stick, I climb. Well, maybe this aileron goes down a little bit and this aileron goes up. Well, these stabs do this and they're all splitting, and it gets much more complicated when you're in a turn. But you're basically just telling it how you want to fly, and it's doing it for you. But it's just that's not necessarily the intuitive piece. It's all kind of flying, and you learn how to deal with it. The aircraft is just intuitive with regard to control. Like if I want to, especially when you're in like the hover, if I want to go to the right, I just push on the stick to the right a little bit, and you perfectly go to the right. And then when you stop pulling to the right and you level out, you stop. It's not like that in the Harrier. It's not as intuitive of a feel. Like if I want to rotate my nose to the right or to the left while I'm in a hover, you put on the rudder pedals and you're gonna turn while your wings stay level. You're going to turn in a hover. So it's just an intuitive feedback to the pilot.
It's basically a completely different flight law in your hover. It is not at all. It's just different translation from input to what the surfaces do. I will say there's different control laws that we have too. So when I'm on the tanker and I open my air refueling door, there's a different control law now that is applied, and it makes it easier for me to be on the tanker. Interesting. I heard that about the Airbus A400M, although they didn't want to talk about too much what exactly this does, but they have direct lift control, so you can go easily up and down. Anyway. Cool stuff. So I just very quickly, I got to fly with the Thunderbirds last year, and I got about 10 minutes stick time in the F-16. And I was
awesome.
Big, lifelong dream of mine. But I was extremely surprised how much force you still have to actually pull on the stick, even though it's completely artificial. Like you have to really pull seriously to get your 7-8 Gs. It makes sense because you don't want to bump into the stick and get 9 Gs. But I was surprised.
Yes. The F-35 is not quite like that. It gets you, well, typically the F-35 is not going to be as slick or easily, you're not going to as easily get to some of those higher Gs and sustain them because the F-35 is heavier. But it has a much nicer feel than the F-16.
In the vertical case, so you already talked about the different flight law in hover mode, but of course one of the big traditional challenges in these kind of vertical capable aircraft is the transition between vertical and classical flight. Because you have to, for example, in the Harrier, you have to manually move the nozzles back. But if you do it too fast, you basically fall down because the wings don't produce lift already. And so you have to kind of do this all manually. Do you have a lever in the F-35 to control the engine's angle, or how does this work?
It's all autonomous for the most part. You get into certain regimes where you're allowed to select basically getting into the hover mode, and it's all on the touchscreen. You go up and you say, computer, I would like to slow down now and go into this to this mode. And if you meet the parameters that safely would get you there, you will enter into that mode then.
You basically fly into an envelope, and when you're in that envelope, then the other mode takes over.
Yeah, if you select it.
Yeah,
right?
if you say, of course, yeah.
Yeah, so it's easy as that. You select it, and then at that point, you've selected it, and you monitor a number of things to make sure that you're safe.
Yeah.
And then you start flying it in that other mode, and it's a very seamless transition from that wing lifted, kind of flight into the engine lift mode.
And so then what do the controls do? Obviously, the rudders do yaw rotation.
Yeah, the stick right and left is going to translate you right and left.
Right, yeah.
The rudder, will translate you directionally, so where your nose is pointing. And then up and down is maintained with your stick as well. So if you want to climb, you pull back. If you want to descend, you push forward. And then the computer is doing the rest. A lot of it's autonomous. So a lot of it, I can enter into certain modes and say, I want to go fly at 50 knots now. And I enter the speed, and it'll take me to 50 knots and it'll stop me. There's other modes too, where I can say, hey, I'd like to hover now. So I press a button, and wherever I'm at, if I'm in that mode, say I'm going 60 knots and I press a button, it will safely slow me down to 0 and allow me to hover. And you can even go backwards a little bit.
So this kind of control means that the designers kind of assumed that this situation, when you want to do this vertical work, you're not in a hurry, right? If you will, you have time to say, okay, I'm going to the touchscreen and select slow me down, stop, and then the aircraft has time to do that. It's not a very dynamic environment at that point.
No, it is just for landing. Yeah. And the landing phase is dynamic enough. So you're absolutely right. There's no hurry up in this scenario. The pilot needs to be very meticulous as they go through. But it can happen very quickly. Don't get me wrong. It doesn't take forever to get to these modes. Like I can very quickly slow down, hover, and then land if need be.
Yeah, no, but what I meant, for example, I mean, I don't know, but I would imagine if you're in a Harrier and you're in that like hover situation and you just push the stick forward, the nose goes down, of course, and then you can kind of, do an air show style accelerate forward and stuff. That's not the idea of the automated modes in the F-35, I think.
No, it's not. It is interesting, once you get close enough, you basically line up everything and then you just push down on the stick. And there you can get yourself in trouble if you try to stop that rate of descent and try to climb, at certain altitudes. I will say that there's also roll posts. So part of the engine is diverted into the wings. Part of the engine exhaust is diverted into the wings and allows for roll control while you're in a hover. And there is an auto eject capability that the F-35 has. If there's catastrophic failure in like one of the roll posts or one of the engines in certain regimes, it will eject you right away because there's no way a pilot would recognize it and be able to get out in time.
Right. Last question. In the regular flying, like non-vertical, do you notice differences between the three variants?
Oh,
I mean,
sure.
One has a bigger wing, so it's probably more agile at lower speeds.
Yeah, so they all have different G limits just because what they are. The B variant is a 7G, the C variant 7.5G, and the A variant's a 9G aircraft.
That's because the Navy pilots can't deal with 9Gs, right? Because of the F-18.
Yeah, they're not as strong or as good looking
as
the Air Force pilots. That's what I hear. That's not me speaking. Yeah, right. The F-35A, think of it like a strike eagle, which most people have never flown a strike eagle, so they wouldn't know. But it has basically a good brake turn. It can sustain energy down low, and you could get into a rate fight down low. So rate fight, think like high speed, high G, compared to a radius fight, which is low speed, lower G, where you're trying to make your radius really small. So we call it a radius fight. Rate fight is you're going much faster and you can sustain G. So it can do that. It can work well in those regimes. It also has pretty good low speed capability. The F-35B is similar. It's a little more sluggish because it's heavier. I mean, the lift fan and that whole mechanical getup behind the pilot is very heavy. They counter the heaviness by just taking off fuel. So the F-35B has less fuel, but for the most part, the A and the B fly very similar. The big difference is with the F-35C, and it's also not that big of a difference, but noticeable when you're flying. It feels more maneuverable. It feels like it digs into the wind more because guess what? Not the wind, the air. Yeah, it digs into the air more. It's because it is actually digging into the air more. Like it has bigger wings and bigger tail, so it's more maneuverable. It can fly slower, as we've already talked about, because it lands on the boat, which allows it to be more effective in a slow speed type of an engagement. So I don't know. Most of the pilots I talk to, it just feels like a more solid, maneuverable aircraft. But they're all good. I mean, they're all minor differences.
Yeah. And you would think that the flight control system might try to mask these differences, but you can't mask a bigger wing. I mean, it has more drag. Right. You can't out accelerate that with electronics. It just doesn't work.
Right. No, exactly right. Yeah.
All right. So let's talk about testing. Generally, what's the work share between the testing of the manufacturer and the testing that the Air Force does? You were on the Air Force side, and Lockheed did the testing, of course, on the manufacturer side.
Yeah, it's interesting. The program has gone through different phases. So the military testing has been the majority of testing. So Lockheed Martin is the prime contractor, and they did initial what they do acceptance flights of aircraft when they come off the line. But before aircraft come off the line, this was a joint test effort between Lockheed Martin and the military, the DoD. So I really, at Edwards Air Force Base, so I'm in the Air Force, I represented the Joint Program Office out of DC, and I was their Edwards site lead. And as the site lead, I oversaw the Joint Program Office's program, which was a Navy, Marine, Air Force, and partner nation kind of program. So we had a joint venture with Lockheed there. And the initial birds that came out, they were flown by test pilots. Lockheed, I think some of them, Air Force, others. And they came out to Edwards Air Force Base or Patuxent River, where the F-35B and Sea Flight Science is done. And then we tested together where you would have about 2 to 3 Lockheed Martin test pilots initially when we started up, and around 6 Air Force test pilots that were flying it. I should say 6 military test pilots flying. We also have had at Pax River a BAE test pilot also fly it. So we're industry partners help us through all of the steps of this. And when I was at Edwards, the team of 1,000 people made up of government, civilians, and military members also included contractors. So we had Pratt & Whitney individuals, and we had Lockheed Martin people. So we had a team of like 400 or 500 Lockheed Martin people on our test site that were integrated very well into the test force and developed how we were going to test. They ran control rooms while we were testing. They helped us analyze. So I had a hard time knowing who is Lockheed and who is government, which is really good. We worked really well together. And at the same time, they'd have a few pilots that flew missions just like the rest of the military pilots. So it's a very close-knit team. Yeah.
It's not like the manufacturer does all the envelope expansion and aerodynamic testing, and then you guys take over and, for example, do operational and weapons testing. You came in much earlier.
Yeah, the military did everything for this from the very beginning with Lockheed Martin and our industry partners.
Interesting. So then it was also probably that group together who designed the test program and thought about what needed to be tested and how.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, the government's running the show, right? So they are the ones at the Joint Program Office who developed the test plans, and it was all Lockheed Martin on contract supporting that effort. The final say was with the government.
So if you certificate and test a civilian airliner, then there are FAA and EASA regulations based on which you do that. So there is predefined criteria. I wonder, is there a catalog like that as well for military aircraft, or do you basically come up with a type-specific test program, and once that's done, it's done?
Yeah, it is very complicated. I am not an expert with all of that. It is very complicated, and what you have are test plans, and then those test plans are going out and getting the data and making sure the contract is met. And at the same time, there are a number of test points in that test plan that are certification purposes. A lot of it's certification, but there are certain specific certifying test points that the certifiers use. And those certifiers is a joint effort by LCMC, which is Life Cycle Management Center, is an Air Force Material Command Center, and NAVAIR. So the Navy and the Air Force were responsible for certifying the F-35 ultimately in the end. So we collected the data, we got it to the certifiers, and the certification process is a very long and arduous process, rightfully so. I mean, they have to make sure that the system is working the way that it's supposed to work, that's not going to hurt any of the users or anyone on the ground or anyone else involved, and meets contractual, requirements. So, the certification process is actually longer than the flight test process. When we finished flight test, it was still another, I don't know the numbers, but it was months and months before they actually ended up certifying it, just because of all the paperwork required to get it right.
So let's talk through a couple of typical or interesting test points or milestones in the test program. I guess the obvious first one is the first flight, but that was, I guess, before your time, and also something Lockheed did. So what was the first thing, let's say, that you, as the Air Force Lockheed joint team, did?
Well, with me on the program, there are a few really big challenges that we had to deal with. One was the engine fire that happened at Eglin Air Force Base. And so there was a problem with the engine, and there was a large fire. So we had to kind of not go back to the drawing boards, and Pratt did awesome, figuring this out, and the engine is very reliable now. So we had some of those big challenges at first that we had to overcome. Because that I'm not going to get into all the details of what happened with the engine fire, but there was an issue with the design of the aircraft, with the engine specifically, that Pratt had to go back and fix. And so as a whole organization, we tackled that together as a team, which was great. So that was a big one. Another big milestone was really getting the weapons certified. So weapons testing is very complicated, and there's multiple phases of weapons testing. So I want to make sure that the weapon is on its own aerodynamically sound and safe. And then I'm going to make sure that it flies safely on the wing of the aircraft or in the weapon bay, whichever one. And then I'm going to make sure that it separates safely from the aircraft and all the regimes that it's supposed to separate from. And then I'm going to actually go fire it at a target and see if it hits the target. So you see all the different complications of this testing, with the last one being the most difficult, because now the whole system has to work beautifully together and integrated in order to hit the target that it's supposed to hit. And that's for the missiles, the bombs, and the bullets, because we had a lot of different weapons that we needed to initially certify and test. So that testing was this huge challenge because it was so large. And it was actually awesome. What we ended up doing was what we called a weapons surge, which has never been done in flight test before. But we went out the door, and in 30 days, I think it was maybe 31 days, we certified 30 of the weapons during weapons events. which was like this huge sprint by the team. It took 6 months to prepare every day and all these resources, because each one of these missions is millions and millions of dollars and months of planning by everyone, industry and the government and the test team itself. So that was like one of the biggest hurdles, and just weapons testing in general was a huge challenge. And then I'd say the other biggest challenge that I think that this platform had, and there's some other things like that we won't get into, like the resting hook had a problem initially. It took a few years. They had to redesign the resting hook because it wasn't catching the cable correctly. When they tested it, that's why we flight test actually. Back in 2011, they tested it. It wasn't working. They redesigned it. It works great. But one of the biggest challenges was stability of the mission systems. So when I say stability, like it's software driven piece of hardware, right?
I understood what you meant.
Yeah. And software. So all of the different pieces, like you have an electronic warfare suite, you have a electro-optical targeting system, a targeting pod on the front of your aircraft. You have your radar, you have data links, you have that DAS system that I was talking about. All these different things have to work together, and they have to start up correctly, and they have to not impact each other. So they shut down. Like when one shuts down, you don't want the whole aircraft to shut down. So it took years for the software to become stable. So for years and years, the engineers were working on just stability of the system. And once they solved the stability piece, they were really able to develop the capability of each one of those systems. But I would like to add, too, it is extremely difficult to test the integration of all these systems. It's what we call fusion. It's fusing all these sensors together. Because, if my radar isn't working, is it not working because it's just not working? Or is it not working because the IR system had a number that went to the EW system, electronic warfare system, that was used by the electro-optical targeting system, that was fed into the radar wrong, and the radar's not working now because of that complex and complicated integration. It was hard to pinpoint what the problem was with the system. Yeah,
I do software professionally. I know.
Yeah,
my systems are probably a bit simpler, but they have enough problems, so I can imagine.
So those were some of the big highlights of getting through the stability and being able to do multi-ship work. Because the bread and butter of the F-35 is its ability to work with other F-35s and also other platforms on the battlefield. I mean, it is really a quarterback. It's really cool to see. But we had to develop a lot of that so that it could actually work with other platforms. It took a lot of effort.
I hear the F-35's main role is to show the AWACS where the other aircraft are.
No, well, not quite. I mean, the AWACS is very beneficial in a number of scenarios the F-35 cannot help with. Like the AWACS is definitely needed, but when you get up close into a fight, onto the battlefield, and you're talking, within 100 miles or so, and I just made up that range, but a range like that, the F-35 is going to become really the eyes and the ears for everyone else on the battlefield because they are going to be so well connected with each other.
They can share sensor data between them.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's quite impressive. When you did these weapons carriage and aerodynamics and separation tests, did you, I guess, install special cameras and data links to monitor all of that from the ground? Yeah,
if you go online. If you go to my sites too, the ones I mentioned earlier, you can see one of the aircraft have all these dots on them. And you'll wonder, like, what are the dots for? Well, that's all for weapons separation testing. So we'd have high-speed cameras. We'd have high-speed cameras that we'd put on the wing that would use those dots for reference points, and they would videotape, and they would live stream that real time to other people as well. We'd also have a videographer that was in the back seat of usually an F-16 aircraft on the wing, videotaping everything that's going on, because that's really important data. And then everything's heavily instrumented. So you see the one aircraft that is, it's called AF-1, and it's the first test, productionized test aircraft that came about. And it was like $500 million because It has so many sensors. It doesn't even have a radar and other things in it. It is only used for a few specific test points. But it has sensors all through it.
Strain gauges everywhere, probably.
Everywhere, yeah. It's
Yeah.
collecting all the data that we need in order to certify those weapons.
Yeah.
And really, like we do loads testing with it too. So those test aircraft that we had were all very, very specialized in their instrumentation. And you'll actually see radio antennas all over those aircraft. If you look at a picture and you're like, Cinco was lying, that F-35 has antennas. Those are the test aircraft because we had telemetry that we had to send out. And we don't need to be stealthy while we're testing. So
no, well, it's probably not very helpful if nobody could see it. Did you destroy some of them during testing? And by that, I don't mean crash. I mean overstress or do something to it that would render it economically infeasible to fix.
No.
Okay.
No, they approached that correctly. They had some Iron Birds and some other stress testing platforms that they used at Lockheed Martin in Fort Worth.
Yeah.
But yeah, no issue. Actually, we oversped and over torqued, some of those aircraft, myself included, because some of our test points are they're at the corner. Well, the corner of the envelope. Your listeners probably understand what that envelope is. When I have to get a test point where I'm pulling 9Gs at 700 knots, I have to go to 720 knots in order to really get that test point because I need to get to 9Gs at 700 knots. Yeah. So we had to overspeed the aircraft very smartly. And at times it would get away from us and we would really overspeed or over-G the aircraft, but nothing that we couldn't, kick the wheels and buy the maintainers some beers and they wouldn't be able to fix.
Yeah. Although in contrast to earlier times, you couldn't hide it, right? Because of course the aircraft tracks all of this and records everything. So
absolutely, yeah, exactly.
Do you know if the F-35 was ever spun, as in spinning stall? It was.
Oh yeah. We did a number of that tests. I did not. I didn't do spin testing. That happened before me. It was one of the first things they do. I've done some out of control flight before, but yes, we did spin testing with a spin chute on the aircraft. And it turns out the aircraft is extremely stable. So it was really hard to spin. And when we do spin it, it recovers. Right. So in a good way, it was a little,
isn't it
not exciting.
Isn't it dynamically unstable like the F-16 is? It is. Okay.
Yeah, it is. But just the way the flight controls and it's all set up. I think it is, but it's solid when it's recovering in out of control situations.
I wonder how this works because you can't switch off the flight control system in order to stall it or to spin it because then it just probably destroys itself within a few seconds. So, but on the other hand, you have to switch off the protections, right? Because otherwise the aircraft wouldn't let you go slow or high AOA enough to get into the spin.
Well, yes, kind of. So the F-35 is a little different than, say, the F-16, where you can't do certain things. Like it won't let you do those things. But you can get there usually in the F-35.
Okay.
We do have something called flight test aids.
Yeah.
So it was a special screen that was developed for the test pilots to do very specific roles under certain loadings, and we can bring up certain things in our helmet that other pilots would never use to make sure that we're on our parameters that we need to be. And I think they had some capability to help them get to some situations to get the data that they needed.
What's the ratio between flight time and test flight preparation, briefing, debriefing time? And I don't mean for the whole team because then it's more or less infinity to zero. Sure. But I mean for you as a pilot.
So as a pilot, we would usually support developing a test card, which would be a handful of hours, maybe a day with the test team. And then we would do simulator missions. So it really depends on the test, I should say, from the get-go. But we would do simulator missions to make sure that we could get the data that we were looking for based on the maneuvers. So when we do test card development, we're writing down like, how am I going to get to this point? For instance, if I need to get to 1.5 Mach at 27,000 feet, well, that's pretty fast KCAS. Calibrated airspeed. So you need to go to the sim and figure out like, what if I start at max AB at 33,000 feet and a 20 degrees nosedive? Am I going to reach 1.5 Mach at 27,000? Or am I going to reach it? Never. Or
Yeah.
am I going to reach it at 30 and I'm going to be outside my data band? Because the data drives us to where we need to prove the system is working. So we have to develop the card, we sim it, and then we will do a mission briefing, usually one day before, where we sit down with the whole team and we talk through all of the test cards. And then we do the day of mission, which is usually a 12 to 14 hour day, where we'll show up, we'll mentally prepare, sign the aircraft out, get the weather, the NOTAMs. Then we go do a briefing for about an hour to go through all the cards. We bring our target aircraft in, we tell them what it's going to look like. We talk with our tankers at that point. Then we go do ground ops for about an hour. We do about a 4-hour flight. Usually, our test flights are usually 4 hours. They're pretty intense. And then we will go land, get back in the building. It takes about an hour to get ready, and then we'll debrief with the whole team. So it's a very long day, and a huge team effort, of course, to get us there. But we're pretty involved. In the F-15C, when I did testing, I wasn't as involved in developing the testing. I showed up to a lot of briefings, and they just handed me cards. They're like, all right, these are what you're going to go fly today. Collect the data on your own. There's no control room. And then I come in and land and tell them, like, this is what I saw, and go look at my tapes, engineers. So there was more of that in other platforms compared to this platform because of the phase of testing we were in.
So you probably did kind of one of these flights per week, roughly, kind of sounds like?
Well, because I was a commander, I usually only flew once a week.
Okay.
When I spent a year as the director of operations in the squadron, which I was number 2 military person in command. And I was responsible for the day in, day out activities of the squadron. And there I flew once or twice a week. I flew more when I was the DO because that was my job, to get involved. But as a commander, I had more programmatic responsibilities and strategic responsibilities.
So how many people roughly were involved in the actual execution of the flight, in addition to you?
So maintainers aside, and the maintainers are such an important piece of this, so I don't want to downplay that value because it's a huge team of maintainers that would keep these aircraft up and running. And there are specialized maintainers. We had military, but we also had civilian and Lockheed maintainers that none better in the world. The team, it depended on the mission, was typically around 30 people. So if I would go do one flight, I'd have about 30 people that were supporting. Myself flying, you'd have a target aircraft, usually someone in their back seat, because they're usually 2-seaters. You'd have the tanker crew, which you could just count that as one, really, because they're supporting other missions too. But then you have your control room. So you have a test conductor, and they're usually like 25, 30-year-old, young adults out of college. I mean, some of them were graybeards and older and awesome, right? But you could have rooms with these young adults, and they were in charge of running the test mission. So they were the one talking directly to the pilot, the conduit between the pilot and the rest of the control room.
Capcom.
And then you have all these discipline engineers. So you'd have propulsion, flight controls, hydraulics, radar, data links. You'd have all these SMEs in their areas that were in the brief. They would go to the control room and they would be monitoring their system and feeding information to the test conductor. There was also a test director who was actually overseeing the test conductor and kind of the objective third party look at what's going on. And they would jump in with really valuable information if need be. And they would talk on the radio too at times. And each aircraft would have this. So a lot of times we do multi-ship missions, especially with mission systems. I mean, if you're testing this, you need to make sure that it works with other F-35s. So we did a lot of like 2 or 4 ship missions. And so each room would have 30 to 40 people in it. So you're looking at 120 engineers like in a control room monitoring one mission.
Wow. Okay. And the fact that you'd use a tanker, I'm a bit surprised by that you would use tankers in these flight tests.
One of the most expensive parts of flying is getting airborne. So once you're airborne, you want to maximize that time that you're airborne collecting data. So we had to be very smart on how we were using our time while we were airborne. And there's limitations like because you don't want to get people killed, and it can be very exhausting. We'd have limits on like how many high G points you could go after in a sortie, how many low G points, how many hours you could do a test mission.
Yeah.
So we couldn't fly for that long, but you could go for a 4-hour mission.
Yeah.
If it weren't all testing, and then the tankers were vital in getting us done.
But these weren't exclusive to you, as you said, because otherwise it would be probably more expensive than another takeoff or landing if you have to pay for the full tanker.
Actually, well, no, most of the time, there are a lot of times where we did share tankers, but a lot of times where they were exclusive use just for us.
Wow.
And we would suck through their gas quite a bit, especially with some of the high G loads points, because you'd go out the door and be an afterburner a lot. And if you're an afterburner, you're pissing away a lot of fuel. Sure. So you would go for 10 minutes, you'd have to come back and get fuel. 10, 15 more minutes, you come get fuel. So you would run tankers dry on a lot of our missions.
They don't come directly from Edwards, right? They came from elsewhere and then met you somewhere.
Yeah, they had some at Edwards that we would use. But a lot of times they'd come from off station, and then we'd use KC-135s and KC-10s. And it was always funny. As an Air Force guy, I would have to probe and drogue refuel with the F-35B and C. So learning to refuel that way was kind of a kick in the pants.
Which of the two is harder?
The B variant and the C variant had probes.
Yeah.
So you drop a probe out and you hit a drogue chute. And the A variant was the boom. And I found that it's different. Boom refueling, it's easier to get in position because you just nail a position and the boom operator flies the boom into your receptacle. And you just now need to stay in position. But it's harder to stay in position once you're on the boom. Yeah. It's the opposite for the B and the C. It's harder to get the chute. Yeah. Once you get it, it's like stabbing in the with your eyes closed, like trying to get this thing on the probe. But once you get it on there, it's much easier to stay in position.
Yeah. I have 3 more questions, all of them hopefully relatively short. One is how does testing an aircraft like the F-35, how does that differ from doing the same with the, for example, F-15? You were obviously involved in that as well, because the aircraft has much more, I guess, diagnostics, computational power. So how does that change the test mission?
Yeah, they're very different. A lot of times in the F-15C, it was really pilot driven. Like, what did I feel? What did I see? How did I subjectively evaluate that system? In the F-35, it was more objective data. How am I going to get to this test point? How's the instrumentation? How's the team working together? How's the control room interacting with us? What do the engineers see real time? Because you didn't have that same telemetry typically on our F-35, on our F-15 missions. You didn't have those control rooms. Some missions, but often not. So it was just a very different type of approach. And a lot of that's because, the F-15s have been around forever. And so it's different technology and a different age. And so the F-35, because of its systems and how it works with other things, you needed those experts in the room. So it's just very different feel testing the different platforms.
Last question on the F-35. Do you think she's beautiful?
I do, yeah. I think she looks slick.
Okay.
I like the way the F-35 looks.
Don't you think like an F-16 or F-15 is like still a little bit more?
It's hard to say. So the F-16, I will say, I think the F-15, F-16, and F-35 all have unique aspects of them. I won't call out one. They're all really beautiful looking aircraft, right? I do like the curves on the F-35 because it's all kind of molded in one. True, yeah. And so it's really sleek looking, but there's something about like a clean F-16 that's really awesome. And then an F-15, I mean, that's my first love, right?
It is, right? It is just a majestic airplane.
Yeah. It is. But then you took a look at the A-10, of course. Yeah, the A-10's ugly.
Purpose-built is the word, not ugly.
Yeah.
So last question. Talk a little bit about these Noble Eagle missions you were involved in. I thought that was interesting, something that not everybody does. I mean, being the commander of the F-35 task force is also not for everybody, but still.
Yeah, no, the Operation Noble Eagle is an important mission where fighter aircraft are there supporting no-fly zones. So if there's certain things, events going on, or certain people, like the president is in locations, you have aircraft supporting those events or those individuals. And so we would be responsible for protecting primarily the president when he's outside of DC. And we would be protecting trespassers that get into a no-fly zone that always follows the POTUS around. So pilots should look for these no-fly zones. They're restricted flying areas that temporarily come up. So TFRs is what we call them.
Yep.
And if a pilot is doing their job, they should know that they're not allowed to fly in this area. Well, a lot of people wouldn't look at these NOTAMs and would accidentally fly in too close and penetrate these TFRs. And our job would then need to go intercept these poor, usually, like rich doctors that aren't really aviators, but have planes and don't, they're not experts. And we'd go intercept them, and then we'd have to get them out of that no-fly zone and keep them away from the president. And then, of course, there's always the threat that they're meaning to do that and they're going for the president. And so we'd be armed and ready to, take them down if it came down to it. It's never come down to it.
Yeah.
And typically is it can be very scary flying because you're up in a cap, we call it, a patrol at 20-something thousand feet, and then you get a call that there's someone trespassing down at 1,000 feet going 100 knots.
And a Cessna 172, yeah.
Exactly. And so you have to drop down. You're not fully in it. You could be on the sixth hour of your mission. You've been refueling. Maybe it's in the middle of the night. We do this all the time, 24 hours a day. So, 2 a.m. And all of a sudden you have to drop down to 1,000 feet and find this threat and make sure that they were just, some pilot that wasn't aware and needed to get diverted away.
And fly slow enough to...
Yeah. And so you'd pass them. You'd have, 150 miles an hour of overtake. Yeah. And you'd have to pass them and get their tail number so you could, get that tail number to authorities so they could track where that aircraft was coming from. So you'd pass them once and you get one letter. You'd be N, November, and you'd come back through and you'd be like, a 1, I think. Maybe it was a 9. I don't know. Shit. And you'd keep passing them. And then you would roll out, you would fly in front of them, rock your wings and get them to turn towards an airfield that you would direct them to land at, and then their authorities would come and meet them, and usually slap them on the wrist and take away their license basically for flying because they should have known not to get close to the president.
Shouldn't they be in theory either on 1 to 1.5 or some other watch frequency at which you can talk to them? In theory, that would be the case, right?
In theory, absolutely. But all of those efforts were done before they called the fighters in, typically. So they just could not reach these people that were flying around without radios where they shouldn't be flying. And I have plenty of stories of scaring myself, and I'm sure wetting a number of general aviation aircraft as a fighter flies out in front of them, 200 miles an hour faster than them, rocking their wings. And getting them to turn. I'm sure that at first they think it's cool. They're like, oh, cool, a fighter. And then they realize that they're in trouble.
Yeah, if it's that close, it's probably beyond cool. Something else.
Oops.
Yes, oops. Yeah, exactly. It's funny when years ago when there were still these Air Force exercises in Germany, there were also these temporary restrictions, obviously. And when I was flying my glider at that time, I typically made it a habit of tuning in the respective information frequency and hearing all the people who had no clue that the exercise was going on be reminded by ATC, hey, if you continue flying straight like you do, then you're just going to fly directly into this. Oh, really? Really funny.
Right. I will, before we sign off, I love Germany. I used to live there.
Yeah, I heard about that. Yeah, where were you stationed?
Yeah, well, I was stationed in Mannheim, Army Post, and I lived in Weinheim, which was just north of Heidelberg.
Yeah.
And we lived there for 3 years, and it was glorious. It was just an amazing country and great people, and we miss it.
A nice area also.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it was gorgeous.
Yeah. All right. Cinco, this was great. Thank you very much for taking the time and for telling all the stories. Very interesting.
Yeah, Marcus, I'm glad we could connect, and I look forward to supporting any questions that your viewers may have if they want to shoot them to you, and you can get in touch with me.
Cool. Thank you very much.
Yeah, great speaking with you.
Absolutely. Bye.
All right, bye.
All right. Thank you, Tucker. This was really cool. Listeners, you should really check out Cinco's Instagram. He does post nice videos and pictures, but he also has quite a bit of explanations for all of these, which most people don't do on Instagram, but he does, which is nice. And when I checked out some of his videos, I found one that really fascinated me, especially, which was an F-35 tail slide, meaning you go up vertically until you run out of airspeed. And then, of course, once the aircraft stops, gravity kicks in and the aircraft falls down backwards a little bit until it then flips over with its nose forward, and then the pilot recovers. I didn't expect that flight testing involves that. It's also an interesting question what the flight control system does up there when airspeed is 0, because it can't do much, right? There is no aerodynamic effectiveness of the aero surfaces. And so anyway, so I did just a story here. I did these tail slides with the glider, mostly unintentionally. So when you try to fly a hammerhead, which is also you go up vertically and then almost just before you stop, you press left or right rudder. And this means that basically the aircraft turns around the yaw axis, basically it turns around one of its wings and then goes down vertically again. And if you time it badly, if you press into the rudder pedal too late, then the rudder doesn't have effectiveness and the aircraft just stops and also falls back, flips over, and then you pull out. And the problem there is that if you don't grab the stick and the rudder tightly to make sure it stays centered, the aerodynamic forces of the backward slip basically might, force the ailerons or the elevator against the stops and potentially rip it out. So it was always very important during aerobatic training when you mess up one of these hammerhead turns that whatever you do, you really grab the stick and hold it very tightly, that while you fall backwards, it doesn't crash against the stops and potentially damages it. Apart from that, you can only wait until the aircraft is nose down again. And then, of course, once it's nose down, it gets fast, you get airspeed and you pull out, not a big deal. There is also an acrobatic figure called, in German it's called Männle or Weible. It's kind of a little man or little woman, kind of, where you go up vertically, and then you intentionally let it flip over forward or backward. That is something that not all aerobatic gliders are allowed to do for various reasons. Anyway, I was very interested to see this kind of thing being flown with the F-35. I wouldn't have expected it. So anyway, check out Cinco's Instagram page. It's really interesting. I really like the fact that he talks a bit, or writes a bit about the pictures and doesn't just post pretty pictures. All right, Cinco, thank you very much. Hope everybody else liked it as well. Let us know, usual feedback. And you can reach Cinco also on Facebook and TikTok, and the account is @CincoHamilton. And of course, I'll link to it from the show notes. All right, so that's it. Talk to you in about maybe a week, 10 days, 2 weeks, whatever. Ciao. Hello, Markus here for omegatau. Omegatau is an independent and non-commercial podcast produced by Nora Ludwig and me, Markus Vötter. We are on the web at omegataupodcast.net. You can also find us on Facebook, Google+, and Twitter under the handle Omegatau Podcast. We love to hear from you through a comment on the website, a post via our social network channels, or via an email at feedback@omegataupodcast.net. We also always appreciate recommendations of Omegatau to your friends, directly or through social media. Omegatau is licensed under the Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, Non-Derivative License 3.0. This means that you can freely share the content, but you cannot use it for commercial purposes, and you cannot distribute derivative works. You always have to attribute the source, omegatau.podcast.net. Any quotations or citations of our work are perfectly fine, of course. For more details on the license, see creativecommons.org. Thank you for listening to this episode of our podcast, and talk to you next time.
Omegatau.